The silent world. The wind brushed through the iron bars of the city playground, carrying the faint squeak of rusted swings and the laughter of children who ran across cracked concrete with the kind of energy only childhood could carry. It was an ordinary Saturday morning for Brooklyn, though nothing felt ordinary for Evelyn Hart. The CEO of Hartwell Industries, one of the most powerful tech companies in America, stood at the edge of the playground in heels that did not belong on such ground, her tailored navy coat wrapped too tightly around her frame as if the fabric could shield her from what she felt inside. Her world was one of power, conference rooms, investors, cameras, and constant scrutiny. But none of that mattered when she looked down at the small girl standing by her leg. Ava, her 6-year-old daughter, stood frozen like a statue, her dark curls falling across a pale face that rarely changed expression. Her eyes followed the children who shrieked with joy on the merry-go-round, but she made no move to join them. She hadn't spoken a word since the accident, not one sound in nearly 2 years. Doctors called it selective mutism, born out of trauma. But to Evelyn, it felt like a curse, a constant reminder that for all her billions, for all her power, she could not give her daughter the one thing every mother should: her voice. Evelyn tried, again and again, to coax her child into the games. She bought the best therapists, hired the most expensive speech pathologists, surrounded her with toys designed to stimulate expression, but Ava always retreated further into silence. Now, as Evelyn stood by the rust-chipped fence, she felt that silence echo louder than the playground itself. Parents gave her sideways glances. Whispers carried. Some recognized her face from glossy magazines or business news reports. They saw the cold CEO, untouchable, successful, but no one her. He saw the truth. The terrified mother hiding behind immaculate clothes and a hardened gaze. She had brought Ava today because someone suggested unstructured play might open her up, but as she watched her daughter stand alone in the shadow of the slide, Evelyn's heart sank. She thought the morning would be just another reminder of failure until a shadow fell across her line of sight. Marcus Carter arrived at the playground with his little boy Eli, carrying him on his shoulders with the kind of energy that only fathers who have learned to bear weight beyond their years can carry. His construction boots were caked with dried mud, his jacket torn at the seam, his palms calloused from endless overtime shifts, but his eyes held a warmth that could melt through the harshest days. Eli was 4, bursting with life, chattering about dinosaurs as if they were alive just around the corner. Marcus lowered him gently, setting him down with a playful roar, and Eli laughed so loudly the pigeons scattered. Evelyn caught herself watching, struck by the contrast. Where her daughter was silent, this boy was pure noise, and yet the noise was not irritating. It was healing. Eli ran straight toward the sandbox, his small shovel already in hand, but stopped when he saw Ava. He tilted his head, studying her with curiosity, then with the kind of boldness that only children carried, he trotted up to her. "Do you want to build a castle?" he asked, holding up the plastic shovel like an offering. Ava blinked, frozen, her lips parting as if words wanted to come but couldn't. Evelyn tensed, ready to intervene, to save her daughter from embarrassment, but something in her stilled. Eli didn't seem to notice the silence. He plopped down in the sand and began building anyway, chatting as though Ava had answered. He told her about dinosaurs that stomped and kings who ruled castles, his words spilling faster than the sand he poured. For the first time in months, Evelyn saw something shift. Her daughter crouched beside him, her small hands reaching tentatively toward the bucket. No words, not even a laugh, but movement. A crack in the wall. Evelyn's breath caught. Marcus, who had been watching from a bench, noticed Evelyn's tense stance. He stood and walked over, his limp barely noticeable until he drew close. Years of work injuries had left marks, but he carried himself with dignity. "He's friendly," Marcus said softly, his voice deep but kind. "Sometimes too friendly." Evelyn turned, her instincts prickling. She was used to men approaching her with agendas, with recognition, with deals to propose. But Marcus's eyes held no calculation, only a quiet patience. He didn't seem to know or care who she was. "Your son? He doesn't mind when she doesn't answer?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Marcus shrugged with a half-smile. "Kids don't care about silence the way adults do. They just keep talking until the world feels less empty." For the next hour, Evelyn stood in quiet astonishment as her daughter played silently but willingly beside Sarah. The little boy made her stack towers of sand, knocked them down with exaggerated gasps, then rebuilt them. Ava's shoulders loosened, her eyes widened, and once, a fleeting sound escaped her, a breathy hum that might have been a laugh. Evelyn froze, her hand clutching the rail. Marcus saw it too, his smile softening. "That's something," he said. Evelyn could only nod, her throat tight. When it was time to leave, Eli tugged his father's sleeve. "Can we come back tomorrow? I want to finish the castle with her." Ava looked up at him then, her lips moving as if she wanted to answer. Nothing came, but the intention was there, shining in her eyes. Evelyn felt tears burn behind her lids. She hadn't seen her daughter look at anyone like that since the night of the fire. She gathered Ava into her arms, but for once her daughter did not resist, did not stiffen. She leaned against her mother, still silent, but somehow louder than ever before. Evelyn drove home in silence, but her mind replayed every detail. Who was this man? What did he have that she, with all her money and power, did not? Why did her daughter respond to him and his boy as if they carried the missing key? That night, while her penthouse windows overlooked the glittering skyline of Manhattan, Evelyn found herself restless. She had board meetings to prepare, emails to answer, investors waiting for reports, but none of that mattered. All she could see was her daughter's face in the sandbox, leaning forward, almost ready to speak. And she could hear the stranger's words echoing in her mind. "Kids don't care about silence the way adults do. They just keep talking until the world feels less empty." The next morning, against every instinct of control and pride, Evelyn dressed Ava in her warmest coat and drove back to the playground. She told herself it was coincidence that they simply needed fresh air again, but deep down, she hoped. She hoped the boy and his father would return. And as the car idled by the curb, her heart skipped when she saw them. Marcus carrying Eli, both laughing as if joy were their only currency. Evelyn's chest tightened. For the first time in years, she wasn't stepping into a boardroom to command respect. She was stepping into a playground to seek hope, humbled by the possibility that maybe, just maybe, a worn-out man and his little boy could give her daughter something no empire ever could: her voice. A collision of worlds. The second visit to the playground should have felt ordinary, yet Evelyn could not deny the knot of anticipation curling in her chest as her car pulled to the curb. She told herself she was simply giving Ava routine, that children thrived on consistency. But beneath her carefully chosen words lived the truth. She hoped to see the boy again, to watch the way his effortless joy chipped away at her daughter's silence like sunlight prying through frost. She adjusted her sunglasses, straightened her coat, and reminded herself who she was: a CEO who faced down billion-dollar negotiations and ruthless competitors. And yet, as she stepped onto the cracked sidewalk holding Ava's hand, her heart fluttered like a novice standing at the threshold of something unknown. Marcus was already there, sitting on the bench with Eli nestled against his side. His clothes were no cleaner than yesterday, his boots still worn, his hair unruly, but there was a steadiness about him that seemed to anchor the chaotic swirl of the playground. He looked up as Evelyn approached, and for a fleeting moment their eyes locked. His gaze held no recognition of her wealth or power, no thinly veiled calculation of how to use her presence. It was a gaze stripped bare of judgment, the kind of look one human gives another when both carry burdens invisible to the world. Evelyn felt strangely disarmed. Eli wriggled free from his father's arm and bounded toward Ava with unfiltered delight. "You came back!" he shouted, his voice so full of sincerity that Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Ava hesitated only a second before stepping forward, and though she said nothing, the corners of her mouth twitched in the shadow of a smile. She lowered herself beside him at the sandbox, her small fingers finding the plastic bucket as though yesterday's timid gestures had quietly stored courage for today. Evelyn froze where she stood, a strange warmth spreading in her chest. It was as if her daughter had taken her first step all over again. Marcus noticed the flicker of emotion on Evelyn's face. He gestured toward the empty space on the bench. "You might as well sit. They're going to be at it for a while." Evelyn bristled at first. She wasn't accustomed to being told what to do, certainly not by a man with frayed sleeves and tired eyes. But something in his voice, not commanding, not pleading, simply steady, made her lower her guard. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, her posture stiff as though her body itself resisted the vulnerability of being here. For a while they watched in silence as Eli narrated their sandcastle kingdom. His words filled the air with dragons, knights, and secret tunnels. Ava remained mute, but her body leaned closer, her hands mimicking his, and once she even pressed a small shell into his palm as if offering tribute to his imagined king. Evelyn's eyes stung. This was progress no specialist, no therapist had coaxed from her. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice low and rough with years of labor, but gentle in tone. "And she's opening up, you can see it." Evelyn swallowed hard. "You don't understand. She hasn't spoken in almost 2 years. She rarely admitted this aloud. To speak the truth was to invite judgment, to admit failure, and Evelyn Hart did not tolerate failure. But here, on a park bench beside a stranger, the words slipped free. Marcus nodded, his expression solemn but not pitying. "Trauma locks doors. Sometimes it takes another child's laughter to find the key. Kids know how to listen to each other without words. That's something adults forget." The weight of his observation struck her. Evelyn had lived in a world where everything was measured in reports, numbers, and outcomes. Yet this man, who likely scraped by paycheck to paycheck, had just articulated something more profound than any professional she had hired. She studied him from the corner of her eye, the creases at the edge of his mouth that spoke of both hardship and humor, the slight limp that betrayed old injuries, the calluses etched deep into his hands. He did not belong in her world, and yet in this small arena of sand and laughter, he held more authority than she did. Their conversation meandered. She asked about Eli, and Marcus spoke of his boundless imagination, of how he liked to turn cardboard boxes into rocket ships and plastic spoons into swords. Evelyn found herself listening more intently than she had in years. She noticed the way Marcus's voice softened when he spoke of his son, the way pride and exhaustion intermingled, forming something raw and real. When he mentioned his wife, his words stumbled, caught between memory and loss. She died in a fire," he said finally, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It's just been me and Eli since." Evelyn wanted to say something, but the sincerity in his voice left no room for polished condolences. She remained silent, sensing that silence, too, could be a form of respect. Later, when Eli asked if they could play tag, he tugged Ava by the sleeve. To Evelyn's astonishment, her daughter followed, her small feet chasing after him across the uneven pavement. No laughter escaped her lips, but her body moved with an ease Evelyn hadn't seen in years. The sight unraveled her composure. She pressed her hands together, whispering to herself, Please, God, let this be the beginning. When playtime wound down, Eli turned to Ava with a wide grin. Tomorrow, let's bring toy dinosaurs. I'll show you the T-Rex roar. He threw back his head and unleashed a sound so comically fierce that nearby parents chuckled. And then it happened. So slight, Evelyn thought she had imagined it. Ava's lips parted, and a soft sound emerged, almost a whisper of a laugh. Not a word. Not yet. But undeniably a sound. Evelyn froze, her chest clenching. She turned to Marcus, who had witnessed it too. His face softened into a smile, warm and unhurried. There it is, he murmured. For Evelyn, time fractured. In that moment, she was no longer the CEO whose decisions shifted markets. She was simply a mother witnessing a miracle. Her daughter had spoken. Not fully, not clearly, but the silence had cracked. She wanted to weep, to fall to her knees, to thank this stranger and his boy who had unknowingly breathed life back into her child. But Evelyn Hart had spent years building walls of composure. She straightened her coat, gathered Ava into her arms, and whispered, "It's time to go, sweetheart." Marcus stood, nodding politely. "We'll probably be back tomorrow, too. Eli doesn't let go of new friends easily." Evelyn's throat constricted. She wanted to ask how he had done it, how his son could reach where every specialist had failed. But pride restrained her, the old instinct to never reveal vulnerability. She turned away, yet her feet dragged, reluctant to sever the invisible thread tying them together. That night, as Ava slept curled with her stuffed rabbit, Evelyn wandered the vast emptiness of her penthouse. The silence that once felt like control now pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. She poured herself a glass of wine, set it down untouched, and paced before the floor-to-ceiling windows. She thought of Marcus, of his simple words, of his presence unadorned by wealth or status. She thought of his son's laughter breaking through Ava's silence, and for the first time in years, Evelyn admitted to herself that she did not have all the answers. The next morning, she found herself debating whether to return to the playground. Her calendar overflowed with board meetings and investor calls, but her heart tugged toward the sandbox, and the sound of a laugh barely formed. Finally, she canceled her meetings with a few clipped words to her assistant. When Ava looked at her questioningly, Evelyn crouched down, brushed a curl from her daughter's face, and said softly, "We're going back." As they stepped onto the playground again, Evelyn's pulse quickened. Marcus and Eli were there, as though waiting. Eli ran forward, holding 2 toy dinosaurs. He handed the smaller one to Ava. "This one's yours. He's a velociraptor." Ava hesitated, her fingers trembling as she accepted it. Then Eli demonstrated the roar with full-bodied enthusiasm, stomping his feet and growling. The children nearby laughed, and to Evelyn's astonishment, Ava pressed the toy close to her chest and opened her mouth. A tiny sound emerged, faint but deliberate, as though she were trying to echo him. Evelyn's breath caught. Her daughter was trying. Marcus turned to her, his eyes kind. She trusts him. That's half the battle. Evelyn's composure cracked. She looked at him with something close to desperation. How? How does he reach her when no one else can? Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward Eli. Because he doesn't ask her to be anything but herself. No pressure, no expectations. Just a kid playing in the sand. The simplicity of it struck her harder than any therapy session ever had. Evelyn had built her life on expectations, on results, deadlines, perfection. But her daughter did not need any of that. She needed space to be, without demand, without judgment. Evelyn felt as though she had spent years building a fortress that now crumbled beneath a single truth. Love was not about control, it was about presence. As the sun dipped and shadows lengthened, Evelyn gathered Ava to leave. Eli waved enthusiastically. "See you tomorrow." Ava clutched her dinosaur tightly, her lips twitching as if she longed to say the words too. Evelyn pressed a trembling kiss to her daughter's hair. For the first time in years, she allowed herself hope. Yet as she buckled Ava into the car, a new thought seized her. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant vulnerability, and Evelyn Hart did not do vulnerability. But tonight, as she drove through the city lights, she knew one thing with startling clarity. She could not ignore Marcus Carter and his son. Somehow, in the cracked playground of Brooklyn, their lives had collided, and nothing would ever be the same again. Breaking barriers. The third morning arrived with a sky the color of pale silver, the kind that promised rain but had not yet decided when to fall. Evelyn sat at the edge of her bed, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders like a cloak she could not remove. Her assistant had already called twice, reminding her of a critical investor meeting, yet she silenced the phone with a decisive gesture. For years she had lived by the rhythm of calendars, negotiations, and flights across oceans. But ever since that laugh, soft and fragile, escaped her daughter's lips, the cadence of her world had shifted. Ava was not simply a child. She had become Evelyn's only compass, and right now that compass pointed not toward glass towers and boardrooms, but toward a broken playground in Brooklyn. When they arrived, Eli was already there, crouched with his dinosaur toys lined neatly in a row, Marcus leaning against the bench with the quiet patience of a man who knew how to let the world move at its own pace. Evelyn felt her heart jolt at the sight of them, though she quickly suppressed it, tucking emotion behind the practiced mask of composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She was Evelyn Hart, billionaire CEO, the kind of woman who commanded headlines, yet here she was standing on chipped concrete, clutching her daughter's hand as though she were the one afraid to let go. Eli's eyes lit up when he saw Ava, his joy so pure it seemed to ripple outward. "You came back! I saved you the T-Rex today!" He pressed the larger dinosaur into her small hands, demonstrating its roar with exaggerated ferocity. Ava blinked, then clutched the toy tightly, her lips moving without sound. Her silence, however, did not deter Eli in the slightest. He barreled on with stories of epic battles and secret caves, pulling her into a world where words were optional and imagination did all the talking. Evelyn lowered herself onto the bench beside Marcus, unable to look away from the fragile miracle unfolding in front of her. "She's smiling," Marcus murmured, his deep voice steady, as though pointing out the most natural thing in the world. For Evelyn, it felt anything but natural. Her daughter's smile had become such a rarity that she feared it might disappear if she blinked. "She hasn't smiled like that in years," Evelyn admitted softly, her tone almost reverent. Marcus glanced at her, his expression neither pitying nor surprised, simply present. Children bloom when they feel safe. Sometimes it doesn't take a miracle. Sometimes it just takes another child who doesn't expect anything back. The simplicity of his words cut through her like a blade. Evelyn had paid for the finest therapies, flown in specialists from Europe, invested in programs that promised breakthroughs. Yet all her money had failed, while a boy with a plastic dinosaur succeeded. Her instinct was to resist the lesson, to remind herself that she built empires by refusing to believe in easy answers. But as she watched Ava reach for another toy Eli offered, her defenses weakened. Marcus was right. Her daughter did not need results. She needed presence, safety, and someone who believed in her without condition. That afternoon, as the children constructed a sprawling fortress of sticks and sand, Evelyn found herself speaking with Marcus more openly than she had with anyone outside her corporate circle in years. She asked him about his work, and he described long shifts at construction sites, the ache of scaffolding work on cold mornings, and the constant scramble to pay bills. Yet even as he spoke of hardship, his tone carried no bitterness. only a quiet determination. Every day's a fight, but Eli makes it worth it. He's the reason I keep getting up, Marcus said, his eyes softening as they followed his son darting across the playground. Evelyn felt something stir within her chest, a mixture of admiration and discomfort. She had spent her life surrounded by men of power, but none of them had ever spoken with such raw sincerity. She told him cautiously about Ava's mutism, how doctors described it as trauma locked inside her mind. She stopped short of revealing the accident, unwilling to peel back the wound fully. Marcus listened without interruption, nodding as if he understood. Kids carry weight in ways we don't always see. Sometimes all they need is someone patient enough to wait with them until they're ready to lay it down, he said. Evelyn looked at him sharply, wondering how a man who lived so far outside her world could articulate truths that eluded every expert she had hired. As the days passed, Evelyn found herself returning to the playground again and again. Each time, the distance between her and Marcus shrank, not in physical space, but in trust. She began to notice the details she had overlooked before. The way his limp worsened on colder mornings, the way his shirt cuffs bore the frayed evidence of years of labor, the way he always knelt to Eli's level when speaking to him, making the boy feel that his words mattered. She noticed, too, the dignity with which he carried himself, never asking for anything, never reaching beyond what was his. One afternoon, when the clouds gathered heavy and gray, Evelyn made the mistake of offering him money. She had watched Eli's sneakers come apart at the seams, his small toes nearly peeking through, and instinctively she pulled out her wallet. "At least let me get him new shoes," she said, her tone sharper than she intended, as though trying to disguise compassion as efficiency. Marcus stiffened, his eyes darkening. No. The single word cut sharper than any rejection she had faced in boardrooms. "I don't take charity. Eli will have what he needs, and he'll learn the value of working for it." Evelyn flushed, stung. She wasn't used to refusal, and certainly not from a man who, by every measure, needed what she could offer. Yet beneath the sting was something else. Respect. He refused not out of prideful arrogance, but out of dignity. The same dignity that kept him waking every morning to work shifts his body could barely handle. It humbled her in a way she had not felt in years. "I didn't mean to offend," she said finally, her voice lower. Marcus exhaled, his expression softening. "I know, but my son needs to see me stand on my own 2 feet, even when they're shaky." The words lodged in her mind long after she left. That night, as she watched Ava sleep, Evelyn considered how she herself had built her empire on standing tall, on never appearing weak. And yet, in all her strength, she had failed to give her daughter what she needed most: safety without demand. Marcus, a man who had lost nearly everything, had given it freely. It unsettled her. It humbled her. It terrified her. The following week brought an unexpected storm of consequences. Word spread among her board members that she had been seen frequently at a rundown playground in Brooklyn. Photographs surfaced, grainy but damning, of the powerful Evelyn Hart sitting on a park bench beside a working-class man. In her world, appearances mattered more than truth, and whispers of impropriety began to coil like smoke. Her father, Henry Hart, called her one evening, his voice dripping with disdain. "You are Evelyn Hart, heir to an empire, not some social experiment in pity. I won't have our name dragged through the mud over some stranger." Evelyn clenched the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. She wanted to scream, to tell him that the man in question had given her daughter more in a week than her empire had in 2 years. But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she ended the call, her chest heaving with a fury she could not release. The next day, she returned to the playground anyway. Pride, fear, reputation, All of it seemed hollow compared to the sight of Ava running, laughing silently, her face alight with joy. When Eli held out a small toy and Ava whispered almost inaudibly, "Mine," Evelyn's knees nearly gave out. It was her daughter's first clear word in 2 years, spoken not to her, not to a therapist, but to a boy with muddy sneakers and a heart full of imagination. Evelyn pressed her fist against her lips to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. She looked at Marcus, whose eyes glistened with quiet triumph, and for a moment she wanted nothing more than to collapse into his arms and let the weight of years finally fall away. But she didn't. She straightened, smoothed her coat, and whispered, "Thank you," though her eyes carried the depth of a gratitude words could never hold. Marcus nodded once, understanding more than she had spoken. That night, Evelyn stared at her reflection in the penthouse mirror. For the first time, she wondered if she was brave enough to keep walking this path. Because she knew now, this wasn't just about Ava finding her voice. It was about her, Evelyn Hart, learning that her empire had been built on silence too, and if she truly wanted her daughter to speak, she might have to unlearn everything she thought she knew about strength. And as the rain began to fall against the city glass, she understood something else. Marcus Carter was no longer just a stranger at a playground. He was becoming the storm that could either shatter her carefully built world or rebuild it into something she had never dared to imagine. The past resurfaces. The morning after Ava's first whispered word should have felt like triumph, but for Evelyn, it carried a new kind of dread. She woke with sunlight streaming through the penthouse curtains, the city skyline sharp and brilliant against the glass. Yet all she could hear was the echo of her father's voice on the phone. "You are Evelyn Hart. You do not lower yourself to playground benches beside men who have nothing." His words pressed against her ribs like an iron band, a reminder of the world she came from, the world of image, legacy, and power. She had fought her entire life to meet the standards he set, to prove she was not simply his daughter but his equal. And now, 1 week at a playground with a man who owned nothing but dignity, threatened to unravel everything. Still, she could not stay away. Ava's tiny voice, "Mine," haunted her like a fragile flame she was desperate to keep alive. She told herself she would go back, if only to ensure that spark did not fade. Yet as she dressed Ava in a soft yellow coat and drove through the busy streets of Brooklyn, she felt eyes on her even before she reached the playground. A black car idled at the corner, cameras protruding from its windows. The moment she stepped onto the cracked pavement, the clicking began, relentless and sharp, like a chorus of judgment. Evelyn clenched her jaw, shielding Ava against her side. She had faced boardroom interrogations fiercer than this, but never with her child in the spotlight. She wanted to shout at them to leave, to tell them this was not news, just a mother at a playground. But she knew better. In her world, the truth mattered less than the story others could spin. Marcus noticed immediately. He stood from the bench, his body tense as he spotted the men with cameras. "They following you?" he asked, his tone steady but his eyes sharp. Evelyn's lips pressed thin. "They always do." For the first time, she saw a flicker of unease cross his features. He had lived his life in relative obscurity, where mistakes could be hidden in shadows. In her world, shadows never stayed dark for long. Yet before she could explain further, Eli ran toward Ava, his toy car in hand, oblivious to the flashing lights. "Let's race!" he shouted, his voice piercing through the chaos. And Ava, sweet, fragile Ava, followed him, her steps light, her toy dinosaur clutched in one hand. Cameras snapped furiously, immortalizing every second of their innocent joy. By the next morning, the headlines blazed across every tabloid and business magazine. Billionaire CEO Evelyn Hart seen in Brooklyn with mysterious single father. From boardroom to playground, Hart's secret life revealed. The silent heiress speaks? Evelyn sat in her office, the stack of papers spread before her like a battlefield. Her board members filed in, one by one, faces stern, voices sharp. They spoke of reputation, of investor confidence, of how easily billions could crumble if image faltered. "You cannot afford to be associated with this," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Evelyn's nails dug into the armrest of her chair. She wanted to remind them that this man, this single father they spoke of with such disdain, was the reason her daughter had begun to heal. But she bit her tongue. Her world was one where showing vulnerability was akin to bleeding before sharks. That evening, her father came to see her in person. Henry Hart was a man carved from marble, his posture as rigid as the empire he had built. His gray suit was impeccable, his voice as cold as ever. "You are throwing away everything," he said, pacing the expanse of her living room. "Your daughter is the future of this company, Evelyn. Do you want her remembered not as an heiress, but as a spectacle? Do you want her image tied to some construction worker with nothing to his name?" Evelyn stood by the window, her hands trembling, though her voice remained firm. "My daughter spoke, Father. For the first time in 2 years, she spoke. And it was because of him and his boy. Not you, not your empire. Him." Henry's eyes narrowed, the faintest crack in his composure. "Children recover. Specialists can be hired. Do not delude yourself into believing this. This accident of circumstance means anything." Evelyn turned sharply, her eyes blazing. "It means everything. Because no amount of your money, no amount of your power ever gave her back her voice. He did. A man with nothing but patience and kindness did what all your fortune could not." The words hung heavy between them, a defiance Evelyn had never dared before. For a moment her father looked almost human, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed. Then he straightened, coldness resettling like armor. "If you continue this folly, do not expect me to shield you when the board comes for your seat." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing like a verdict. Evelyn stood long after the door closed, her chest heaving. For the first time in years, she realized she did not fear losing her seat, her empire, or her father's approval. What terrified her was losing the fragile light that had begun to flicker in her daughter's eyes. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own reckoning. At the construction site, whispers spread after the tabloids surfaced. Co-workers ribbed him, some with envy, others with contempt. "Hey, Carter, when you moving into the penthouse?" one jeered. Marcus gritted his teeth, his fists clenched. He had never sought attention, and now the spotlight burned like fire. That night, as he tucked Eli into bed, the boy looked up with wide eyes. "Daddy, are they going to take Ava away?" The question pierced Marcus's chest. He pulled his son close, whispering, "No, champ. No one's taking anyone away. We just have to hold on, no matter what storms come." The storm arrived faster than either of them expected. Days later, Evelyn returned to the playground, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She sat beside Marcus, her hands twisting together. "They want me to cut ties," she admitted, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "The board, my father, everyone, they think you'll ruin me." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And what do you think?" Evelyn turned to him then, her eyes raw. "I think you saved my daughter." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low but firm. "I don't want to be your project, Evelyn. I don't want to be some charity case you defend in your meetings. I've fought too hard for dignity to let anyone strip it away, not even you." His words were not cruel, but they cut deep. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. "You're not a project. You're the only person who's given me hope. Do you understand what that means?" Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady. "It means you're standing at a crossroads. You can either choose their world, or you can choose hers. But you can't straddle both forever." At that moment, Eli came running, dragging Ava by the hand. She was laughing, truly laughing, a sound so light and full it stopped Evelyn's breath. Then, in a voice small but clear, Ava whispered, "Daddy?" But her eyes were not on Evelyn. They were on Marcus. The sound pierced through Evelyn like lightning, her daughter's first word, directed not to her, but to him. Marcus froze, his eyes widening, his lips parting in shock. Eli grinned, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. "See, Ava talks now!" Evelyn staggered to her feet, her chest tight, her mind spiraling. Her daughter had spoken, but the word belonged to Marcus, the man her world condemned, the man her father despised, the man her board would destroy her for. He had become the anchor of her daughter's healing. As the sun set behind the cracked skyline, Evelyn stood trembling on the edge of two worlds. One promised power, reputation, and the approval of her father. The other promised love, healing, and the fragile sound of her daughter's laughter. And as Marcus held Ava's gaze, the choice loomed like a storm that would break before long. Love versus legacy. The sound of her daughter's voice should have been the happiest moment of Evelyn's life, yet instead it left her standing in the middle of the playground with her world crumbling beneath her feet. Ava's first word in 2 years, spoken not to her, but to Marcus. Daddy. The syllables had been soft, hesitant, fragile as a bird's wing, but they struck Evelyn with the force of thunder. She had dreamed of this moment in hospital rooms, prayed for it during therapy sessions, begged the universe for it in the stillness of sleepless nights. And when it finally came, it did not belong to her. It belonged to a man who had nothing to his name but dignity, and a boy with mud-stained shoes who had managed to do what Evelyn Hart's billions could not, give her child back a voice. That night, she could not breathe inside the walls of her penthouse. The place that once felt like a fortress now seemed like a gilded prison. She sat in her daughter's room long after Ava fell asleep, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, clutching the tiny dinosaur toy Eli had given her. Evelyn whispered into the darkness, her voice breaking. "Why him? Why not me?" She was a mother who had everything, yet in the one place she was needed most, she had failed. The next morning, her world struck back with vicious force. Her father arrived with 3 members of the board in tow, their suits sharp, their eyes colder than winter glass. They filled her living room with talk of optics, damage control, and reputation. They did not care that Ava had spoken. They did not care about miracles. They cared only that Evelyn Hart had been photographed in a playground with a single father who represented everything they despised: poverty, struggle, imperfection. "You're endangering the company," one of them snapped, tossing a tabloid on the table. The photo on the cover showed Marcus crouched beside Ava, her small hand resting in his, while Evelyn sat in the background. The headline read, "The Billionaire, the Builder, All, and the Silent Child." Henry Hart's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You will end this immediately. Do you understand? If you do not, the board will move against you, and I will not stand in their way." Evelyn stared at her father, the man who had built an empire out of stone and steel, who had raised her not with love, but with expectations, who had taught her that image mattered more than truth. For the first time in her life, she realized she no longer feared him. What she feared was returning to the silence that had consumed her daughter for 2 years. "No," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't end it." Her father's eyes narrowed, fury flashing in their depths, but Evelyn did not flinch. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own storm. At the construction site, whispers turned into outright jeers. Men nudged each other, pointing at him with smirks. The billionaire's pet, they called him. Some envied him, imagining he would ride into wealth on Evelyn's coattails. Others resented him, mocking the idea of a man like him stepping into a world of marble towers. Marcus ignored them, focusing on the steel beams and bolts, but inside he felt the weight of shame pressing down. He never wanted to be defined by someone else's money. He wanted to stand on his own, to teach Eli that dignity mattered more than riches. That evening, when he returned home with sore muscles and aching bones, he found a folded envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a check, more than he made in 6 months, signed with Evelyn's name. A note accompanied it. For Eli's future. Don't refuse this time. Marcus's hands shook as he held the paper. His pride screamed to tear it apart, but then Eli came running, clutching a crayon drawing of himself, his father, Ava, and Evelyn standing hand in hand. "Daddy, look! We're a family now!" Marcus's throat tightened. He looked at the check again, then at his son, his hopeful eyes, and felt torn between two truths. Accepting it meant betraying his dignity. Refusing it meant denying his son a better future. He placed the check back in the envelope and shoved it deep into a drawer, whispering, "We'll make it on our own, champ. That's the only way you'll ever know what it means to stand tall." Days later, tragedy struck. At the construction site, a rusted beam gave way. Marcus tried to steady it, his body straining against the weight, but the metal slipped, crashing down. He managed to push a younger worker out of the way, but in the process, the beam slammed across his leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain seared through him, white-hot and blinding. His co-workers shouted, rushing to his side, but Marcus's first thought was not of himself. It was of Eli. Who will pick him up from daycare? Who will tuck him in tonight? The world faded into sirens and darkness. When Evelyn received the call, she felt her knees buckle. She rushed to the hospital, her heels clicking furiously against the linoleum floors. She found Marcus pale and bruised, his leg in a brace, his hand scraped raw. Eli clung to his father's side, tears streaking his face. The moment Evelyn entered, Ava tugged free from her hand and ran forward, her small body climbing onto the bed. She pressed her tiny palms against Marcus's arm and whispered, clear and trembling, "Don't go." The room froze. Evelyn's breath caught. Her daughter had spoken again. 3 words, each more precious than diamonds, spoken not to her, but to him. Marcus opened his eyes slowly, wincing at the pain, and managed a faint smile. "I'm not going anywhere, kiddo," he rasped. Evelyn stood at the foot of the bed, her heart splitting wide open. She wanted to weep with gratitude and rage all at once. Gratitude that Ava was speaking. Rage that her daughter's first true words had gone to a man who hasn't even family. Or perhaps, she thought, trembling, a man who was becoming family whether she admitted it or not. In the days that followed, Evelyn visited the hospital daily. She brought food, blankets, toys for Eli. She sat with Marcus when he dozed, watching the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. She wanted to confess everything, that she admired him, that she envied his strength, that she was terrified of losing him. But her pride kept her silent. Instead, she showed her feelings in small gestures, adjusting his pillows, bringing soup, tucking Eli's drawings into the drawer by his bed. Marcus noticed, though he said little. One evening, as the rain hammered against the windows, Evelyn finally spoke. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with frustration. Marcus opened his eyes, his gaze heavy but steady. Because I don't want to be the man who drags you down. Your world and mine, they don't fit. Evelyn's hands tightened on the blanket. My world doesn't matter if my daughter can't speak, and she's speaking because of you. Don't you understand? You're not dragging me down. You're lifting us up. For a long time, Marcus said nothing. Then he reached for her hand, rough and calloused, and pressed it gently. Evelyn, you have to choose. You can't keep 1 foot in their world and 1 foot in mine. It'll tear you apart. At that moment, the door opened. Henry Hart stood there, his expression carved from stone. He looked at Marcus in the hospital bed, at Evelyn clutching his hand, at Ava nestled against his arm, and his lip curled in disdain. Enough, he said coldly. This ends now. He held out a folder, thick with papers. Sign this agreement. Step down quietly. Protect your daughter's future. Or defy me, and lose everything. Evelyn stared at the folder, her father's shadow looming over her. Her heart raced, torn between legacy and love, between empire and healing. And as Ava whispered again, her small voice trembling but clear, stay, the choice grew sharper, more impossible, more urgent. The storm, the night after her father delivered his ultimatum, Evelyn could not sleep. She stood at the wide window of her penthouse, staring at the restless sprawl of the city. The skyline glowed like an army of torches, each light a reminder of the world she had built, the empire she commanded, and the chains that came with it. On the table behind her, the folder of documents sat heavy, waiting for her signature, promising silence and safety if only she surrendered. But each time she turned toward it, she heard Ava's small voice echoing in her ears. Stay. That single word, trembling but strong, carried more power than every contract she had ever signed. Marcus, meanwhile, spent his days in the hospital, his injured leg propped in a brace, his pride stung far more deeply than his wounds. He hated the helplessness that pressed on him like a weight, hated that Eli had to see his father in a bed instead of standing tall. Yet what gnawed at him most was Henry Hart's visit. The old man had returned after Evelyn left, his cologne sharp, his words sharper. He had set an envelope on the bedside table, thick, heavy, filled with more money than Marcus had ever held in his life. Take this, Henry had said, his tone calm but dripping with contempt. Disappear. Leave my daughter alone. Leave that child alone. You are nothing, and you will ruin everything if you stay. Marcus had stared at the envelope as though it were poison. Every instinct screamed to tear it to pieces, yet the thought of Eli's future twisted inside him like a knife. With that money he could pay off debts, move them into a safer home, give his son stability he had never known. But taking it would mean abandoning the very girl who had clung to his arm and whispered for him not to leave. It would mean betraying Evelyn, betraying himself. In the end, Marcus shoved the envelope back into Henry's hands, his voice low but unyielding. I don't sell myself, and I don't abandon people who need me. Henry's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with disdain, but he said nothing more. He left, his footsteps echoing like thunder down the sterile hospital corridor. Evelyn learned of the confrontation the next day, when Marcus told her quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. She felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding with both anger and fear. He tried to buy you off? She whispered, her voice shaking. Marcus nodded once. And he'll keep trying. People like him don't stop until they get what they want. Evelyn turned away, gripping the edge of the windowsill, her knuckles white. She had spent her life bending beneath her father's shadow, living up to his expectations, proving she could be as ruthless as him. But now she understood, ruthlessness was not strength. Strength was a single father who refused a fortune to stand by two children who needed him. The board meeting loomed like a storm cloud, scheduled for the end of the week. Every headline screamed her name, tabloids painting her as reckless, investors whispering about scandal. In the boardroom, whispers grew into threats, until Evelyn knew she would have to make a choice. Either distance herself publicly from Marcus, severing all ties, or risk losing her company altogether. The weight of the decision pressed down until he could barely breathe. But then there was Ava. Each day, as Marcus healed slowly and Eli kept her daughter laughing with endless games, Evelyn saw a transformation she could not ignore. Ava began stringing words together, small at first, broken syllables, but growing stronger each day. She whispered mine when clutching her toy, play. When Eli tugged her hand, stay. When Marcus shifted in his hospital bed. And finally, one evening, as Evelyn tucked her into bed, Ava wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck and whispered, "Love you." Evelyn broke, sobbing into her daughter's hair, her heart splitting open with gratitude and grief. She realized then that her daughter's voice was not simply returning, it was blossoming. And the soil that nurtured it was not power, not legacy, but love. The morning of the board meeting arrived gray and heavy with rain. Evelyn dressed in her finest suit, her armor polished and sharp, yet her heart trembled beneath. She walked into the towering glass building of Hartwell Industries, her heels striking the marble like war drums. The boardroom was already full, her father seated at the head of the table, his eyes cold and commanding. The air was thick with tension. "Evelyn," Henry said, his voice calm but lethal, "this is your final chance. Renounce this distraction. Cut ties with that man and his child. Protect what we have built, or lose it all." Evelyn looked around the table at the men who had spent years doubting her, at the empire that had demanded every ounce of her soul. Then she thought of Ava's voice, trembling but fierce, thought of Marcus's quiet strength, thought of Eli's laughter that had broken through her daughter's silence. For the first time, she knew the truth. "No," she said clearly, her voice steady as steel. "I won't cut ties. I won't walk away. Because the only thing that matters, more than this board, more than this empire, is that my daughter has her voice again, and she found it with him. If that means losing everything else, then so be it." The room erupted. Voices shouted, hands slammed on the table, accusations flew. Henry's face twisted with fury, his control slipping for the first time in decades. But Evelyn stood tall, her back straight, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You taught me power was about image," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You were wrong. Power is about love. And for the first time in my life, I finally understand what that means." She turned and walked out, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. Her heart pounded, fear clawing at her, but also something else. Freedom. She had chosen. Not empire, not legacy, not reputation. She had chosen her daughter, chosen Marcus, chosen love. Outside, the rain poured, drenching her as she stepped into the storm. Marcus was waiting in the hospital courtyard, leaning heavily on his crutch, Eli perched beside him on the bench. When he saw her, his eyes widened, searching her face for answers. Evelyn walked toward him, her heels splashing through puddles, her hair plastered to her face, her suit clinging to her frame. She stopped before him, breathless, trembling, and whispered, "I walked away." Marcus stared, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. You gave it all up?" Evelyn shook her head, tears mixing with rain. "No, I chose what matters. I chose us." At that moment, Ava tugged Marcus's sleeve, her small voice rising above the rain. "Daddy, home?" The word hung between them, fragile but clear, as if destiny itself had spoken through her lips. Marcus froze, his heart slamming in his chest. Evelyn's breath caught, her eyes locking with his. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, everything else fell away. And yet, even as relief flooded her, Evelyn knew the storm was not over. The empire she had walked away from would not surrender easily. Her father would not forgive. The press would not relent. The world would not understand. But as she looked at Marcus and Eli, as Ava pressed close to his side, she realized that storms were not always meant to destroy. Sometimes they came to wash away what was rotten, to clear the ground for something new to grow. Still, the question remained, sharp and dangerous. Could love truly survive the wreckage of power? Or would the storm yet tear them apart before they found the peace they longed for? A new family, a new voice. The storm that Evelyn had walked into did not pass quietly. It stretched into weeks, swirling with headlines, angry investors, and her father's relentless fury. Tabloids painted her as reckless, foolish, blinded by some working-class fantasy. Business anchors speculated about Hartwell Industries collapsing under the weight of scandal. In her penthouse, phones rang endlessly, emails flooded, lawyers sent threats. Yet Evelyn found herself strangely calm. For the first time in her life, she did not measure her worth by balance sheets or glowing articles. She measured it by the sound of her daughter's growing voice, by the laughter that now filled her once silent home, by the presence of a man and his son who had turned her fortress into something warmer, something resembling a home. Marcus left the hospital slowly, his leg healing but still unsteady. He hated the crutch, hated the reminder of fragility, but each time Eli slipped his small hand into his father's palm and said, "It's okay, Daddy. We're still strong." Marcus remembered what strength really was. He had never dreamed his path would cross with Evelyn Hart's again after that stormy night on the bridge, and yet now he found himself walking beside her almost daily, their children laughing ahead of them, their steps awkward but steady. He still resisted at times, still feared the gulf between their worlds, but each day that Ava leaned into him, whispering a new "wabi isi" board, each day that Evelyn looked at him not with pity but with respect, the gulf seemed to shrink. For Ava, the change was astonishing. Words that once hid inside her burst forth in fragile, halting whispers. First simple things like play, mine, stay, then longer phrases. At night she began telling small stories to Eli, her voice trembling but proud, as though she had been waiting years to be heard. Evelyn often stood outside the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face as she listened. No amount of therapy, no fortune could have bought what she now heard, her child reclaiming the world one syllable at a time. Still, the outside world did not forgive easily. Henry Hart grew more ruthless by the day. He sent legal threats, cut Evelyn off from accounts, stripped her name from company documents, and issued press releases painting her as unstable. Former allies turned cold. Old friends stopped calling. For a woman who had once commanded boardrooms with iron authority, the exile was brutal. And yet Evelyn did not falter. She filled her days not with meetings but with breakfasts at Marcus's small apartment, afternoons in the park, evenings helping Eli with his homework. For the first time in years, she discovered the shape of ordinary life, the way steam curled from a pot of soup, the way laughter echoed in a hallway, the way small hands clutching hers gave more meaning than contracts ever could. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the window of Marcus's apartment, Evelyn sat with him at the kitchen table, a pile of unpaid bills between them. She looked at the worn linoleum floor, the chipped mug in her hand, the man across from her who carried more dignity in his calloused hands than her board had in all their polished suits. "Do you regret it?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant. Evelyn looked up sharply. "Regret what?" "Walking away from all of it. For this," He gestured vaguely around the small apartment, at the cramped walls, too, he flickering light. Evelyn thought of the skyline she had abandoned, the empire that had once been her entire identity. Then she thought of Ava whispering, "Love you," of Eli drawing pictures of their 4 hands joined together, of the quiet steadiness Marcus brought simply by being. "No," she said finally, her voice steady. "For the first time in my life, I don't regret a thing." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes there was a glimmer of something softer, something he rarely let show. Hope. For him, love had always been wrapped in loss, tied to the memory of a wife gone too soon, carried in the weight of responsibility for his son. But now, sitting across from Evelyn Hart, he began to wonder if perhaps love could be reborn, not to erase the past, but to grow alongside it. As months passed, the 2 families slowly blended into one. Eli and Ava became inseparable, their bond deeper than even they could understand. For Ava, Eli's constant chatter was the key that unlocked her silence. For Eli, Ava's quiet strength steadied his restless spirit. Together they formed a balance neither child had known before. For Marcus and Evelyn, the bond grew too, in small moments, the brush of hands as they guided their children across a busy street, the shared laughter when Eli tried to teach Ava how to whistle, the silent understanding in hospital corridors, grocery lines, and long walks through rain-slicked streets. But the world still watched. Paparazzi followed, stories circulated, whispers of Evelyn Hart's fall from grace filled society circles. Yet instead of shrinking, Evelyn found herself standing taller. When reporters shoved microphones in her face, demanding answers, she spoke not of corporations or stocks, but of children, of love, of second chances. "I was once proud of being the youngest female CEO of a Fortune 500 company," she said during one impromptu interview outside the playground. "But I am far prouder to be the mother of a little girl who has found her voice again. And if that voice was born not in a boardroom, but in a sandbox with a boy and his father, then that is a story worth telling." Her words went viral, not as scandal, but as inspiration. Parents wrote letters, mothers with children struggling through trauma reached out, fathers raising kids alone sent their gratitude. Slowly, the narrative shifted. She was no longer just a CEO who had fallen. She became a symbol of what it meant to choose family over fortune, love over legacy. The turning point came one spring morning, when Ava's school announced a small recital for parents. Evelyn's heart clenched when she received the invitation. 2 years ago, the thought of her daughter standing before a crowd would have been impossible. Even now, fear gripped her. She worried Ava would freeze, that silence would return, that the progress they had made would shatter under the weight of expectation. But when she shared her fears with Marcus, he only shook his head. "Trust her," he said gently. "She's stronger than you think. She's stronger than both of us." On the day of the recital, the small auditorium buzzed with chatter. Parents filled the rows of folding chairs, cameras ready. Evelyn sat between Marcus and Eli, her hands trembling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break. When Ava stepped on, to the stage, small and delicate in her pale blue dress, Evelyn's breath caught. The room quieted, all eyes on the girl who had once been silent for years. Ava's hands shook as she gripped the microphone, her eyes searching the crowd until they found Marcus. He gave her a small nod, steady, unwavering. Then her gaze shifted to Evelyn, who mouthed silently, "I love you." Ava drew in a deep breath, and then, clear and trembling, her voice filled the room. "Once, I was afraid to speak, but then someone showed me I didn't have to be afraid anymore. He talked until the silence wasn't scary. He stayed until I wasn't alone. And because of him, and because my mommy never gave up, I can talk now. Thank you." The room erupted in applause, tears streaming down parents' faces, teachers clapping furiously. Evelyn sobbed openly. Marcus bowed his head. Eli leapt up and shouted, "That's my sister!" Ava smiled shyly, but for the first time, it was not a fleeting smile. It was radiant, unafraid, a smile that declared she was no longer a prisoner of silence. Afterward, as they walked out of the auditorium, reporters swarmed again, cameras flashing. Evelyn pulled Marcus and the children close, her voice steady, her eyes blazing with conviction. "This is my family," she declared. "Not the one my father built, not the one society expects, but the one love created. And I will never apologize for that." Henry Hart never forgave her. Hartwell Industries moved on without her. The world of power and legacy closed its doors. But Evelyn never looked back, because what she gained was far greater than anything she lost. Months later, on a quiet summer evening, the four of them sat on a worn blanket in the park, sharing sandwiches and watching the sunset paint the sky in gold. Ava leaned against Marcus's arm. Eli sprawled across Evelyn's lap. The air was filled with laughter, small stories, dreams whispered about the future. And as the last light of day faded, Evelyn realized something profound. She had not fallen. She had risen. She had traded an empire of steel for a kingdom of love, and it was worth more than every dollar in her father's fortune. Ava's voice, once silenced by trauma, now rose clear and strong in the twilight. She whispered, almost to herself but loud enough for them all to hear, "Home." Evelyn's throat tightened. Marcus wrapped an arm around her. Eli giggled, and for the first time Evelyn understood the true meaning of legacy. It was not skyscrapers. It was not contracts. It was not empires built of stone. Legacy was love carried in the voices of children who had once been afraid to speak, but who now shouted into the world without fear. And in that moment, Evelyn knew the storm had passed. They were a family. They were whole. They were free.